Welcome to episode 13 of the Football Conversations podcast. In this month's episode, we'll be taking a look at Dundee United's glory years of the 70s and 80s under the guidance of Jim McLean. Joining me to look at this fascinating period in history is the Tayside legend, Jim Spence. Jim Spence, thank you very much for joining me tonight.
Pleasure, Callum.
Please, Jim, can you take us back to the winter of 1971? What kind of position were Dundee United in, and why were they looking for a new manager?
Well, they were looking for a new manager because they'd gone for an extensive period of time with a man who I sometimes think has been underplayed in Dundee United's history, and that was Jerry Kerr, who had, taken them into Europe, at one stage, and had kind of, in a sense, really made them a top-flight club seriously for the first time in their history, But Jerry was kind of, I suppose, the board at that time felt that Jerry was probably kind of past his sell-by date, that the club needed to go in a different direction. He actually stayed at the club for a wee while, but it didn't work out, had to go, in a different direction. And the direction they chose was by going over the road, a couple of hundred yards up the road to Dens Park to take Jim McLean, who had been a player at Dundee, was a coach at Dens, and who many people thought the natural trajectory for him was to become the Dundee manager. And I think you'll still find, Dundee fans of a certain vintage, obviously, because, we're now talking about a period 50 odd years ago. But I think Dundee fans of a certain vintage, given, the trajectory of one club, Dundee United, and the opposite of the trajectory of the other, Dundee, many Dundee fans of that vintage will say they made a massive, probably the biggest mistake in the club's history by not making Jim the manager or head coach, call it what would have been a manager in these days, because, he did incredible things, as we'll come on to, at Dundee United. Well, Dundee, suffered and have in fact been overtaken as the premier club in the city over 2 or 3 decades now. So Jerry Kerr, despite kind of some great success, and among them, among those successes was kind of bringing the tangerine colours to Tannadice, from a tour to America, where they went under the guise of Dallas Tornado and one of these tournaments in the early days to bring football to the States, where various clubs played. United played, Kilmarnock played, West Ham, lots of clubs played. So Jerry was part of all that. In many respects, was a very, very forward-thinking manager, and had brought five. We talked about Dundee United now playing foreigners, but Dundee United under Jerry Kerr raided the Scandinavian market. For people like Leonard Wing and Orion Persson and Finn Seaman, Finn Dossing, and Leonard Wing, and it was quite transformative, kind of. But the feeling was, by that time, that Jerry was kind of, was past his sell-by date, that United needed to move on, and they moved on with Jim McLean.
Well, my next question actually was going to be, Jim McLean at this point, he's a managerial novice, so what was his kind of standing in the game, what were his credentials, and what was it that drew Dundee United to him in particular?
Well, he was getting a very good name as a forward-thinking coach. A very good technical coach with a really good understanding of the game. Some people will say that Jim was a fairly average player. I think he was better than a fairly average player, but he was never kind of one of the scintillating stars of the Scottish football firmament, as a player. He was a very, very tidy player. But I have to say, I never saw him playing, but by all accounts, a very tidy player. But I think, he was getting a name, he was garnering a reputation as a really, really forward-thinking, smart coach who was very much of the modern era, of the modern vintage. And I think the United board very much saw him as the man to take over. And of course, what he was offered at Tannadice, which I suspect he would never have been offered at Dens Park, was carte blanche. You will come to this club, you will run, you will be the general factotum. What you say will
Yeah.
go. We will be your board and we will back you. And at that time, it would have been people like, I'm thinking it would have been George Fox, Ernie Robertson, Little John. These were the kind of directors at Tannadice. And, whereas Dundee had been run very much by the establishment, if you want, the Gillisleys, who were the accountants and families like that. United were run by people who were in the insurance business or the lemonade business, things like that. They were very much kind of, I think, very much seen as kind of the poorer relations and to some extent the working man's team. I mean, that's an oversimplification of it, obviously.
Yeah.
I think the board, wanted to take United in a new direction, in a very kind of modern direction, and they did that with Jim. So he was garnering this reputation, in the game as a forward-thinking, very technical coach, forward-minded, and United went for it. I mean, it could have been a disaster because Jerry Kerr had been there for years at Tannadice, as Jim was. I mean, between the two of them, they ended up doing something like I should have made my note here, but I'm at the stage of the game where my memory goes. But a huge number of years between the two as manager, unthinkable in the modern game. So that was a kind of backdrop to it. Jerry kind of the board thinking past his sell-by date. Jim the forward-thinking manager. What do we have to lose here by bringing him in? And the idea, I think, was that Jerry would be in, and in fact was about the place. Kind of they gave it. I'm trying to remember the official title they gave Jerry, but it didn't work out. It lasted. It never did. It never does. It didn't last a great deal of time. And I think Jerry's family, funnily, my mum, my late mum, was quite pally with Jerry in her final years and his. And he was a lovely man. He was an absolute gentleman. I'll tell you a tale in a moment or two about him, but he's a lovely man, but his time was probably up, and Jim came in, and the rest is history, as they say.
Yeah, it seems quite a sliding doors moment, particularly for Dundee Football Club anyway. Was there any 11th hour attempt at Dens to persuade him to stay, or was it just he was out of there and that was it?
I don't think there was. I mean, I think, Dundee were very much the, still the bigger of the two clubs. They would, I mean, if you'd gone back, to the late 40s, which was crowd-wise, it was the glory period of Scottish football. I mean, late 40s, Dundee were playing to, 48, 49 season, Dundee were playing to an average crowd of 24,500 at Dens, kind of on a par with Aberdeen. I mean, not that far under, only a few thousand under Hibs and Hearts, when Celtic and Rangers, from the Celtic, I think in those days were paying to 36, 37,000, Rangers to 40. So there wasn't, the big city clubs weren't outgunned by the factor that they are nowadays, with the Glasgow duopoly. But that's, that's a slight aside. I mean, Dundee were kind of the bigger club, the premier club they would have seen in the city, although United had been in the top league for some time. And I probably thought, well, that's fine, we'll be another coach elsewhere. And I don't know, to be honest, whether Dundee had any inklings of thinking of Jim as managerial material. But as it was, it was Dundee's loss, I think, and certainly Dundee United's gain, because what he went on to do at Tannadice was probably unthinkable under Kerr.
Did Jerry Kerr have any kind of input in his successor, or was he just happy to observe the process and move into his new role?
To be honest with you, I think the decision came from above, Jerry. It came from the board, who, looking at McLean and looking at probably the way the game was changing as well. Simply thought that McLean was the way to go. Younger, hungry, kind of a driven coach with kind of great technical nous and lots of new ideas, which we'll probably touch on in a moment when he was into his pomp at Tannadice, So, whether Jerry had any kind of actual, input there, I'm not entirely sure, but I suspect if there was, it would have been very limited.
Yeah. So when Jim McLean actually pitches up at Tannadice, what's his initial remit and what sort of early impact did he make with his new squad of players?
Well, when he pitched up at Tannadice, very early on, one of the things he was keen to do was give youth its chance, But to do that, he very much had to rely on experienced players, and he had a group of experienced players. I mean, there were people at the place like Davy Wilson, who played for Rangers, people like Walter Smith, Archie Knox were there. George Fleming, who'd been at Hearts. So Alec Rennie was another one, who had a spell at St Johnstone as well. You're a kind of core very much of experienced, kind of hardened Scottish pros. But what Jim did very quickly was he established. A really, we talk nowadays about youth academies. But Jim was the man who really established that. He would be out and about. Any Sunday you would catch Jim covering 2, 3, 4 games in public parks on Sunday. Looking at the Sunday boys setup, which of course in those days was much more important to the game than it is now, bluntly, where kids now come in and are signed at a very, very early age, So he would have been down watching the Invergowrie Boys Club, where the likes of John Holt came from, or St Columba, where David Neary and Graham Payne came from. He was round the playing fields of Dundee, and he also built. He built a kind of scouting network in Glasgow in the west, and Edinburgh obviously in the east as well, and round about, and he had some great success there. He obviously had Fife as well, and he brought in a core of young players who would go on really very quickly to establish themselves. The David Nerys, the Graham Paynes, the Paul Sturrocks, the John Holts, and the list went on. And to be honest with you, that list just went on for years and years and years, because effectively he built 2 or 3 teams by having such a really, really good youth system that stood Dundee United in great stead, because many parents faced with the opportunity to send their kids to another club, and very often even to Celtic or Rangers, would look at Tannadice and say, and bear in mind there wasn't the vast discrepancy in wages back then. I mean, Dundee United wouldn't have paid nearly as much as Rangers or Celtic, but it wasn't nearly as huge a gulf as it is today. So parents, getting the chance for their kids to go, would think they've got a great chance of playing first team football there, and they would go. So I mean, and very early on, one of his great signings from Drumchapel was Andy Gray. As a young boy, and Gray burst into the team very, very early on. I think he was 16, 17 when he broke into the team. It was a goal machine, and he was away within a couple of years for £100,000 south of the border. But that was indicative that Jim was prepared to build from the nucleus of a squad of kind of older, experienced Scottish pros who were all really good journeymen, and bring in the kids. And he brought one. There were so interesting characters of Frankie Copel, the late great Frankie Copel, who scored the wonder goal against Anderlecht, which can still be seen on YouTube. There were really experienced hands like that about who stayed with him for years, and quite often went on to coach with him as well, helping the reserves and things. So very much when he came in, he was given carte blanche by the board of directors, and it literally was the one-man show almost. I mean, somebody said to me the other day, we're talking about Dundee United's coaching squad now under Jim Goodwin, and it's no different from probably any other club. It seems huge by comparison to probably even what you'd had at Celtic or Rangers. But at Dundee United, it was Jim and 2 men in his bug kind of thing, A very, very small coaching squad. But that was how he started, that seriously kind of hardened group of pros, and he brought this young team in a sense, and most of them went on to great success.
Well, actually, just when you bring that up, Jim, about youth, I was going to ask you, McLean, he was famously stern, brutally straight, and had a real short fuse. How was he able to persuade young players to actually turn down maybe charismatic's an unfair word, more charismatic managers or more kind of lucrative offers from old firm England and join at Tannadice? Did Jim ever wear a different hat when he was trying to convince these guys to play, or did they just look at the evidence of this guy simply plays youngsters?
I mean, it depends what you're talking about. It depends whether you're talking about kind of trying to bring 15, 16-year-olds into the fold and get them in as signings. I mean, in that respect, he was charismatic. I mean, he had a huge name in the game very, very quickly, along with Alex Ferguson. So he was charismatic in many respects. And of course, you know, he was very often, I mean, I think the telly was probably less biased than it is now. So guys like Jim were regularly on the telly and interviews and all the rest of it. And he was very well known. Of course, you only had the BBC and Scottish television in those days, and Sky and, you know, a proliferation of kind of social media channels and all the rest of it. So he was very well known. So that was for bringing kids in. But when he came to kind of further down the line where he started to extend his reach, bringing in the likes of maybe an Eamon Bannon from Chelsea, a Willie Pettigrew from Motherwell, or you know, Jim McInally and Dave Bowman, who, you know, had been south of the border at Forest for Jimmy, I think it was Coventry for Davy Bowman. Then he kind of worked harder, and he I suppose he put on his kind of, because, you know, he could be a charming man, you know, kind of, you know, a bit like the Smiths, you know, this charming man. He could be a charming man. And one of the things he did was, the guys, he took, Dundee in those days, like a great many cities, it was, you know, Dundee was, along with Glasgow, was probably Scotland's, you know, next industrial city. So it can be a grimy, kind of smoky old place. He would take him to the ferry and let him see around about Broughty Ferry, which was lovely and a very nice part of the city to live in, you know, and that was one of the first things he would show them. So that would help attract them. The other thing was, in terms of money, you know, there wasn't nearly the difference in earning power that there is now. I mean, I was talking to one of the United guys from those days a few weeks back. No names, no pack, Joe, but we were talking about money, and, you know, and Rangers were probably paid, you know, double what United were on, but you know, small bonuses. Now, if you were playing in a Dundee United winning team, you were on very, very substantial bonuses, really substantial bonuses, you know. So if you were going winning two or three in a row, or you weren't losing, you know, and you'd gone a good number of games, you could pick up really substantial bonuses. Now, that was, as this individual said to me, it was murder for the guys that couldn't get in the team, because bluntly, you know, the basic wage, very often they could scarcely pay the mortgage, you know, or the rent. But for the guys who were in the team and winning and making the big bonuses, then they were quids in, you know. One or two of the side, I think, invested quite well, because you know, their insurance. I'm trying to remember who. I think it was Bill Littlejohn who was the insurance guy, and I think some of them were steered towards you know, endowment policies in terms of putting the money into pensions, which in those, you know, back in those days were returning 15% per annum. So the compound interest, if you're on a Dundee United side over 6, 7, 8 years, putting your money into pension, you know, returned. I mean, listen, none of them are millionaires. Don't get me wrong. I mean, no players, none of the players from a, you know, vintage in Scottish football, or indeed English football, you know, were millionaires. But, you know, so there was a combination of things. He wasn't charismatic with the parents of young kids he wanted to bring in. He put on the kind of, you know, that kind of charming element when he was bringing players in from other clubs to try and bring them in. And of course, it got easier as United did better. The easier it was to bring them in, and the lure of European football was important as well. But you're absolutely right. I mean, he could be a really, really fierce, brutal. I mean, he could be a nasty character. There is no shying away from this. I mean, and to some extent, you know, it was one of the things that actually bonded and gelled the team. It was almost kind of, we'll show him the manager, but we'll show him. I mean, they really were a tightly bonded group of players, really tight, you know.
I suppose that, I mean, everyone goes on about, you know, the 10-year contracts and the bonus system, but you just said something there, Jim, about it wasn't so great for the guys not in the team. But that creates an incentive to fight to earn your place in the team and to be part of a winning team. I very much doubt you'd get what you get now, where you've got a guy who's happy to be a third choice keeper or something like that. You want to be in the team and winning.
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, he was of his day. There's no. I mean, I had a fascinating discussion with Graham Spears, who's a good pal of mine, last year on Spears' podcast, and we talked about this. We talked about wee Jim. I mean, he was an intriguing character. I remember Graham, who's quite a religious bloke. Graham's father was a minister, and
Yep.
Graham raised the issue of Jim's religion, and one or two people took it the wrong way, thinking we were talking about the kind of the Celtic Rangers thing. It wasn't.
Yeah.
It was the impact of old Scotland, you might say.
Yes.
In a sense, the old Presbyterian Scotland. I mean, Jim, I think, was it wasn't Baptist. I think it was Plymouth Brethren he belonged to. Plymouth Brethren, yeah. And it wasn't so much about religion as it was, but about the characteristics that brought you. And and what it was were these old-fashioned, some might say, old virtuous Scottish characteristics of hard work, graft, loyalty, all of these sort of things. And Jim had all those, and he demanded them as well. He was loyal. He turned Rangers down. He had his chances to go elsewhere. He turned Rangers down. The reasons for us, there's a myriad of reasons, I think, for it. Some of them true, some of them untrue. But so he was loyal. He demanded that from players, and he was. It's intriguing as the passage of time goes on, and we all soften. When we talk about folk that we've had the run-ins and all the rest of it. Some of the players now who will say, he was a real swing. Well, at the same time, in the next breath, after they've castigated him, well, in the next breath, talk about, but what a coach, what a man, and he, he made them. He made some fairly. I hesitate to say ordinary. I don't mean this the way it might sound. I mean, players like Paul Sturrock and David Dodds, who some would have looked at and thought, well, they're nothing special. He worked on these players so that, like the big Dodds, he became a magnificent striker. A guy who could take in air, could win it in air, bring it down, hold it up, bring others into play. Sturrock was the same. You could hit Sturrock. He coached Sturrock to kind of spin off, someone's shoulder and just leave them gasping, leave them for dead. I'm not for a minute suggesting these two guys, among many, had no natural talent, but Jim, I think, honed them and brought the very best out of them, and but it wasn't. I mean, kind of jumping on a wee bit here, but what destroyed eventually the McLean model of football, I suppose, was Bosman. Yes. And Bosman turned world football on its head. It wasn't just Jim. And some people have said it was because of the likes of the wee Jims of this world that we ended up with Bosman. Now, there might be some truth in that, but there were wee Jims the length and breadth of the country. I mean, Giroux, who was observed for goodness knows how many years. I'm not suggesting he was the same tyrannical character as Jim, but he was there forever as well, And there were people like that throughout the game. Brian Clough, who was another magnificently successful manager. And at smaller clubs in the English terms, Derby and Forest, but both very, very decent clubs, not the giants of English football, who will never again, I suspect, recreate. Although saying that Forest are doing brilliantly at the moment, but they'll never recreate the kind of the glory days that they had in the past, because that world changed. You could take a side and you could keep that side for 4, 5, 6, 7 years with really only changing a couple of positions every season or so, so that effectively you had a great deal of continuity, which just isn't available to clubs like Dundee United anymore in the modern game.
No. Well, Jim, just to rewind just a wee bit, early on in the reign, well, maybe about 3 years in, I think it was, the Dundee United reached the Scottish Cup final. They lose to Celtic. Can you remember, was that seen as almost like an indicator of progress, a sign of things to come, or was it seen as the kind of patronising one-off 3-hit day out kind of thing?
Well, I'll think long and hard about this one, because what I can basically remember about it was long before I was ever in front of a microphone. And I stumbled off a train from Dundee and made my way to Hampden Park with a squad of mates, very well under the weather, I think it's fair to say. I don't think United went with any great expectations on that day. I mean, people like kind of Doug Smith and the kind of characters who were played that day. A lot of the older guys. I should remember the team offhand, but for the moment, it's kind of gone. But that was, I think, very much seen as the starting, just to get to that Scottish Cup final.
Yeah,
that was, I think, seen as the starting of something special. I mean, I can remember being on the terrace and what you would call the Rangers end, and
Yeah.
here. That stew, that old black stew you used to get hammed in the standing terrace and going up your nose, make your face all black. And United, I think United took about 6,000 fans that day.
Yeah.
If you fast forward loads of years to the Ross County final, they took 28,000 with them, which was
Yeah.
indicative of the kind of the impact they were making in the city and all the rest of it. But no, I mean that was that was simply charting the progress.
Yeah.
That's all that was. That was laying a marker. We're on our way, and I think it did that. Albeit, they lost 3-1 on the day, but I'm sure it was 3-1 for memory. But that was simply charting the progress of the club, who would go into great things. Although Hampden and United, there was a reason that the fanzine, which I was involved in for a wee while, the final hurdle was named because United felt that so many of them at Hampden.
Yeah. Yeah. Compared to these contemporaries, McLean's working at this time on a relative shoestring. What kind of methods did he employ to close the gap with so-called bigger clubs? And I suppose they use a kind of this. This is more a modern thing, but what would the kind of style of play have been of his teams? What were they kind of typically known for in those days?
Well, Jim was able to mix and match it brilliantly. I mean, if you take kind of some of the stars of the team, you had you had Neri and Hegarty eventually as a central defensive pairing. I mean, he bought Paul Hegarty as a striker for, I think it was £40,000 from Hamilton.
Yeah.
He took David Neri as a boy from St Columba's Boys Club in Dundee, who were one of, if not the most successful boys club in the area. So you kind of mixed and matched guys like that, and so you had Neri, this kind of this elegant kind of he was nicknamed Sash after apparently looked like Sasha Distel, so the boys gave him the nickname Sash in a dressing room. This very elegant kind of figure who could who could defend brilliantly, who
Yeah.
could stride forward, had a terrific turn of pace for a big lad, but was elegance, on stilts in that Dundee United side. You had Hegarty, who was recreated from a striker who kind of probably wasn't going to be a great striker at United's level, but became a tremendous central defender. Paul wasn't a particularly tall individual,
Yeah.
but the leap that he had, his aerial ability was tremendous. He also had the fantastic ability to do a sliding tackle from the back long before they were outlawed. He could win possession
Yeah.
that way. So they were kind of formidable defenders who could either shell it long or they could play it out from defence. Similarly with the fullbacks, people like Eamon Bannon, who could, who could kind of, everyone's seen the mazy run against
Yeah.
Borussia Mönchengladbach, where he beats about 4 or 5 players and plops it in the net. Bannon had that tremendous ability, and bear in mind when you say, to compete against the big boys, Jim spent record fees. I mean, Jim spent.
Okay.
I mean, at one stage, Jim spent £100,000 bringing Willie Pettigrew from Motherwell, and £165,000 bringing Eamon Bannon from Chelsea. I mean, these were
Yeah.
substantial fees
Yeah.
at the time. These were really, really big fees in Scottish football at the time. So he was prepared to kind of spend the money. He was prepared to kind of go out with the club to bring players that he thought had considerable talent and promise. I mean, Pettigrew was a proven striker at the time. Eamon, brought back from Chelsea, was had all the ability in the world, but was kind of still kind of youngish. One of the areas that did cause him problems over years that enough was goalkeeping. He had allegedly fallen with Hamish McAlpine in Japan, which led to the signing of Peter Bonetti. We'll touch on that in a moment or two. But so he was able to kind of, he was prepared to spend money big when he had to.
Yeah.
He brought through having identified terrific talent,
Yeah.
like in the Neres, the Paynes, the Holts, the Sturrocks, the Dodges, Morris Malpass,
Yeah.
I mean, an absolute retinue of kind of young talented players coming through, mingling them with experience. So, and in terms of football, United could play some tremendous stuff, quick kind of racy, pacey runs from Bannon, in later years from Ralph Millen. Sturrock was the same. Or they could play long diagonals up to David Dodds, who would kind of, bring it down, either nod it on, bring it down, hold it up for the likes of Sturrock to arrive. He could mix and match it. We Jim could mix and match it. And I have to say this, he was also, I think now, you kind of look at the game now and you hear people talking about kind of, sports science and dietitians, Jim was into that stuff 50 years ago. Jim was employing at that time, and Jim used to have Harry Bennett, who was Liz, as she was then, Liz Lynch, but Liz McColgan. Jim would have Harry in giving technical advice on sprinting and all the rest. He had Graham Hogg, who'd been a a legendary kind of figure in that field. He was heavily into kind of dietary and sports science and tactical elements of the game and all the rest of it. So he was really, and I think that was all the stuff I think that had been seen by the United board. They knew this. They were hearing all these things about him, and that was all part and parcel of the reason that they went for him. So he was a very, very scientific, coach, and a very kind of ahead of his time coach. The other thing was he worked like a dog. He was never off. Yeah. He was, if he had a spare moment, he was out watching a game somewhere else. You'd regularly see him at junior games. You'd see him at kind of boys' club games. He was out scouting regularly because it's a very small team around about him. So, he liked to kind of see with his own eyes on. And I mean, Graham Payne, who, to me, it's still singularly the finest ball-playing football player I've seen in a Dundee United strip. I mean, I'm slightly biased because I was brought up with Penny. But on a Sunday in Dundee, when Penny had been playing against Celtic or Rangers the previous day, and Penny was down with a squad of us from a place in Dundee called Kipton or St Mary's or Downfield, three kind of areas all, that all kind of intermingled. And Graham would be down along with Billy Gavin, who was playing for Arbroath at the time, Jimmy Morton. Jimmy was playing for St Johnstone, a couple of boys at Forfar. We were a fair squad of guys who kind of were willing amateurs like me, junior football or seasoned professionals. And Penny would play on a Sunday, and every now and again he would duck behind a couple of the boys and say, "I think that's wee Jim there in the car," because he knew this. He knew that some of his pros went out and played with their pals on a Sunday, and he would come out and check. He roughly knew where they were. He'd be out checking, in the car. It was incredible, But he was very much ahead of the game, in terms of his approach to football, to the scientific element, the coaching element, diet, and all the rest of it. And that said, I mean, I think Thursday night was the big night out for the boys at Tannadice and Paul Sturrock's Day and all the rest. I think they were usually at kind of one of the nightclubs in Dundee, kind of giving it a good session, sweating it out the next day.
So the steady progress is made through the kind of mid to late 70s league-wise, and then at long last, 1979, they break the duck. They finally win a trophy when they beat Aberdeen in the League Cup final. How big an achievement was this? And when they actually retained it a year later against Dundee, was that the ultimate signal that power had shifted in Dundee from that tangerine?
It probably was. I mean, I think most folk knew. I mean, Dundee went on to have significantly decent sides after that. I mean, I've had some very good sides after that, but never hit the heights that United did. And in beating Aberdeen, because Ferguson and McLean were fascinating characters. They were actually very, very chummy. I mean, there was much more to it than just a new firm. I mean, once every couple of weeks, Fergie and his coaching squad would be down in Dundee, and Jim and his would often be up in Aberdeen, and they'd be playing each other at head tennis and games of football, stuff like that. I mean, they were pally, but they were great rivals as well. And of course, the great rivalry was between the two teams. I mean, Ferguson built just an absolutely incredible Don side. And the argument rages between those of us who are kind of pally, up here on the East Coast and the North East, as to who was the better. Were Neary and Hegarty better than Miller and McLeish? I mean, these are arguments that are wholly subjective and will never ever be, never be kind of. You'll never win one.
No,
but it was a great period, and to beat Aberdeen in the final at Dens, I think really signified the United were going somewhere.
Yeah.
And then to beat Dundee on their own patch, I think was a remarkable, it was remarkable for a side who'd won all those years since the days of Dundee Hibernian, under their old founder Pat Riley had become Dundee United and had won nothing, bar the Forfarshire Cup, they were once in the Summer Cup finals, I recall, before my time, but that set them on the path.
To
to becoming the club that they did. And they were on. United always had a decent support. I mean, I'm not suggesting this wasn't kind of like a Falkirk in any Stirlingshire or something like that. I mean, United were always kind of also had the ability to be, to pull crowds in and be well supported for big games. I mean, under Jerry Kerr, I mean, against Juventus, I think there was 28,000 at the game at Tannadice. So. But the other thing was, and this might strike some people as strange, although I'm told that to some extent it was the same at Edinburgh. There was very much, and it did change as United became more, predominant, and also as the game became more expensive. But there was very much a week about thing in Dundee.
Yeah.
People would go to Danes, and not them all, obviously, but a fair number would go to Tannadice as well. To see United. They would have their favourites, but they would go. I mean, my late father, had, I mean, I was the youngest of a much older family, so I started going to football with my brother, who sadly we lost about 6 weeks ago, who was 13 years my senior. It was him that really took me to football, because my old fella had stopped going. But my dad was very much a Dens Park man for quality, as he put it, and Tannadice for blood and snotters, as he put it, and to some extent, that of his generation, that would have been true. I mean, not to say United hadn't had some fine sides, but they were lower division. They were usually old second division before they came up under Jerry Kerr. They won promotion against Berwick Rangers in front of 16,500. So back in those early 60s, as you were talking about. So they were always capable of getting big crowds. But Dundee was. I mean, I remember going to Dens to see Dundee beating Hibs. I think they'd played at Easter Road on Saturday in a League Cup game, and it was 3-3, and I think there'd been 28,000 there. And on the Tuesday night in the replay at Dens, Dundee won 3-0, and there was 33,000 at the game.
Yeah.
So Dundee had that ability to pull big major crowds out over that long period of time. That's changed quite dramatically.
Yeah. Well, Jim, May of 1983, the pinnacle is reached of Scottish football with the league title win. What are your personal memories of that day? Were you there? And
yes,
how big an achievement was this to finally win the league title?
Well, it was remarkable, and yes, I was, and again, I wasn't behind a microphone. I was in what they call at Dens Park the Provy Road end. I was in with my wife. We were sitting among the Dundee fans because it was chock a block, and we were in there. And I mean, the game itself, I suppose mainly as a member for a couple of things. One, the magnificent Ralph Milne chip. Then there's a penalty which kind of saved by Colin Kelly, and Bannon puts it away. But the other thing I think it's remembered for is wee Jim as the players try to hoist him at the end, and he's kind of half cracking a smile, because he seldom did. He seldom cracked a smile, and probably for Archie Macpherson's commentary on it. But it was the coming of age.
Yeah,
and to win that league title for a team who, I mean, when I used to go and watch United after Jerry Kerr had left, and wee Jim came in, and I often went week about as well. I mean, I'm seen as being an Arab, although my brother was a Celtic fan, regular as a lad, he was taken to see Celtic, but I mean, I'm seen very much as an Arab, but I went for many years to both grounds. But I travelled to see United and watched them over many years. But I can remember crowds of just over 3,000 for some games at Tannadice. And quite often my wife, who was my girlfriend then, we would go directly from Tannadice up to Dundee's Kingsway ice rink at the old barn to watch the Dundee Rockets, who 3 years in a row were British champions. And on occasions, the Rockets were playing to crowds of 3,600, 3,700, 3,800, packed into the old barn. There were a few occasions where the Rockets actually had bigger crowds than Dundee United. But I mean, as a rule, by the time United won the league, the average, I think the year that United won the league, the average was probably around about kind of 10,000, 11,000. But that was in the days when Celtic and Rangers would come bringing 8,000, 9,000, 10,000 people with them. They probably had a home core. The home core now is certainly much bigger than it was then. Although they always had that potential, they always had a kind of, a home core of anywhere between 5,000, 6,000, 7,000. It's gone up a fair bit since then. But that was the coming of age to win the league for a club with, in a two-team city where one had been very much the dominant side in terms of support and finance and all the rest of it, and to a great extent we're still very, very close to United. I think that was that laid down the marker. That was a signal marker. The United had really arrived. The League Cups were one thing, but to win the league over that long, brutal period. And they did, there's the great myth that they won it with 13 players. I mean, they certainly used pretty much the same 13 players, but in total, I think it was 17 or 18 that season, but they didn't have a huge squad. They weren't by any manner of means a wealthy club, but they were really well run. They were very well structured. One of the things, when harking back a wee bit, you were talking about Jim and his methods and all the rest, and I'd say to you, he was very scientific and all the rest of it. That United side trained like dogs. They were extraordinarily fit. They were extraordinarily fit. I mean, the engine on some of these players was just incredible. The guys like Billy Kirkwood and all the rest who would just run all day. Bannon. I mean, they had phenomenal. And John Holt, a guy who probably a lot of people think. I still think John was underrated. Magnificent player, one of the man of the match at the Nou Camp against Barcelona. John had such an engine, and a great player as well. Hardy, could tackle, could pass, could shoot. They really, really were an incredibly fit bunch of boys.
Would you say, I mean, it's subjective, but Dundee United win the league, Aberdeen win the Cup Winners' Cup. Is that Scottish football's greatest ever season?
Well, if you're Dundee United and Aberdeen fan, yes. I mean, it's pointless trying to compare. It's pointless trying to compare what United and Aberdeen have achieved by comparison to Celtic and Rangers. I mean, we know this. I mean, look, we talk now about this kind of fallow period for the rest of the game. In terms of Celtic and Rangers winning, the championship now, the title, top title for is it 40 years now? Whatever. The truth of the matter is, the top title's only ever been won, I think it's 18 times. By clubs outside of Celtic and Rangers. I think Hibs and Hearts is it 3 apiece? Dundee have won, United have won. I mean, Aberdeen have. So, to win the league title, and Ferguson, did it more than McLean. To win the league title, and what Aberdeen did in Europe were spectacular, truly spectacular achievements. But it's very difficult trying to compare it to what Celtic and Rangers did in terms of was it Scottish football's greatest achievement? I think for the size of the clubs that they were, I think they're utterly remarkable achievements, and we'll not see them again. We'll not see them again. Similarly, you won't see Celtic win the European Cup again, or Rangers win the European Cup Winners' Cup again. I mean, that world has changed. That world has gone. I'm kind of content just to say they were utterly transformational times for both clubs, and you can see, they don't have a soft spot for the Dons. I used to cover a lot of games up there, trackside. I've got a lot of great pals up there. The Dons fans know it as well. They will never achieve again the things they did. I mean, Jimmy Teeling came in. It looked as though he might be really might win the league actually that first half season, But and then that's the nature of Scottish football. I mean, Dundee United have had their ups and downs. They've been relegated and all the rest of it since those glory days. And could be again. I'm not suggesting it will be this season, but that's how the game has changed since wee Jim's day. I mean, when the first Premier League season started, United could so easily have gone down. Dundee went down, and I actually think never recovered again. Never recovered from it, It could have so easily been United, but it wasn't. I mean, those two League Cup victories were really kind of, those were the imprimatur for saying, here we are, we've really arrived now. People knew they were coming like a steam train, but when they won the league, that's to maintain that over that kind of long, grueling season with such a small squad and such a small nucleus that played the vast bulk of the games. That was really a terrific achievement.
It is. It's incredible, and actually, what followed after that was equally as incredible when they go on a wild run to the European Cup semi-final, and they come within a whisker of the final. What went on in those infamous games against Roma?
Well, what went on against Roma was they were cheated. Simple as that. They won 2-0 at Tannadice. They went to the Olympic Stadium And it's well documented now that the referee took possession of, I think it was a watch and various other things. I think I think it was his son or one of the Roma officials, admitted that later on. That said, God bless him, the late great Ralph Millen did blast one over the bar early on in the game.
Yeah.
That might well have made it an entirely different situation, and they might well have gone on to play Liverpool in the final. And that was a side good enough to beat Liverpool. But it wasn't to be. So, I remember going to the semi-final. Just as a fan, I was actually a mature student doing a law degree at the time. And I travelled with my brother. We went on a bus from Dundee. Actually about 4,000 or 5,000, huge support with them. There was just such a sense about the club then. They were unstoppable. Sorry, the quarter final, and then of course they get to the semi against Roma, win 2-0, and you're thinking, surely we can hold on to this, but things conspired against them. A bad miss early on, and undoubtedly the referee was, was a major factor in it. But that's just pure bitterness speaking.
Yeah, it's true. Everything I've read about it as well points to that. But throughout the 80s, McLean masterminds some unbelievable victories in Europe. You mentioned some of the names earlier: Monaco, Mönchengladbach, PSV Eindhoven, Werder Bremen, Barcelona, UEFA Cup final. At this point, how high was Jim McLean's stock? And was there ever a fear that you might lose him, other than the very famous time with Rangers?
Yeah, I think that to some extent, there were different days. Not for a minute I was suggesting the press were cozied up to managers. Well, a lot of stuff didn't get out. A lot of stuff about clubs being after players and all the rest of it didn't get out in those days. So it was unclear as to who. There were a couple of English clubs who looked at Jim and who were keen, but he. And of course, the famous Rangers incident where I think they were going to double his salary, give him a house, and all the rest of it. And he spoke to them, and I think at that time that was the most serious one. At that time, I think people thought he might go. But you had to run of things at Tannadice. I've got a kind of, this is only my personal view, and I have no way of kind of proving or disproving this. I think Jim knew deep down he wouldn't get the time or the control to do things that at Tannadice were absolutely within his control. I don't think he would have got that at Rangers. I think very early, we see with the current incumbent, at Rangers, he's hardly in the door, and there's guys wanting him out already. That's the kind of pressure that exists in that Glasgow Goldfish Bowl, and I think Jim knew that, and that was my suspicion. And Jim, by the way, was well paid. Jim was pretty well paid and did well because Jim was on the bonuses as well. So Jim did very well at United, financially, and rightly so, because he did magnificent things with them. But I think that. I don't think there was ever a kind of like a modern day fear of somebody's going to come in and take him away. I don't think it was something that haunted United fans by any manner of means. He was just in with the fittings at Tannadice, as it was proven, in later years when he became chairman as well. He just seemed to be in with the fittings. It was just kind of, it was just wee Jim. He was kind of
part of the furniture.
Part of the furniture, and Dundee, and historically, as a laddie, when I was kind of growing up in my 18s and my early 20s, Dundee was the third biggest city. Dundee topped it at about 183,000. It was also about 1,000 ahead of Aberdeen. That changed with deindustrialisation. Aberdeen got oil. You throw a blanket over Greater Dundee if you want to put it like that. There's still a couple of 100,000 people here, but it's a small city. If it was by comparison, an English city, it's a small city, and people knew each other and all the rest of it. And there's some incredible tales. A pal of mine who was a cop, long before mobile phones. Charlie had written a letter, and Charlie had played in a very good amateur team. One of the teams at the Sunday Boys team, one of the teams that John Holt played in actually, and Cammy Fraser, who played for Hearts and Dundee and Rangers. So Charlie had written a letter to me, Jim, complaining about what had gone on the previous Saturday's formation, all the rest of it. And he was a cop. And he's finished his shift, and his wife shouted. He was just in having a cup of coffee, going off to bed. Charlie, there's somebody at the door to see. So show him in. Who is it? In comes wee Jim storming in, waving the letter in his face. What the, but having Charlie end up spending about an hour chewing the fat about football,
Yeah.
and that was his style. That was his style. I mean, he could be a fierce fear man, but football was absolutely in his blood.
Yeah.
Absolutely in his blood, and United were in his blood. And I mean, he took to the city of Dundee, and he lived here, and he died here. And I don't think he did want to leave.
No.
And I think it would have taken. It was different times. Maybe if Liverpool had come for him or something like that. I don't know, but I just think he absolutely ran the show at Tannadice. Nobody told him what to do. He knew he was in absolute charge, an absolute command, and that he would go when he felt like it. And not the board. And that was how it proved.
Just when you talked about his kind of how he could be fierce, United, you also mentioned earlier on, Jim, that United lost, I think it was 6 Scottish Cup finals on McLean. Why did they so often fall short at the final hurdle? And if McLean's knowledge and nous was responsible for leading them there, was his kind of anger and overreaching anxiety partly responsible for them failing to bring home the cup?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's often been said that he understood, or he didn't understand, as Alex Ferguson did, that some players responded to an arm around the shoulder, others responded to a kick up the backside. Jim was a one-trick pony with that sort of stuff. Jim never, Jim, whether it was something to do with his upbringing or what, I don't know. Jim could not master that art. I mean, he was to get praise from Jim was glowing praise indeed, but even usually when the glowing praise came, it was stilted. And this is, I mean, I'm not speaking of the dead because I actually got on well with him. I think. I think he actually lacked self-belief to a great extent. I really do. And I think that, I mean, I remember, a well-known referee back in the day saying to me, had Jim, had Ferguson had those United sides, they'd have won much, much more. Willie Miller once told me a great tale, to maybe give you the difference between the sides. And there was no difference in playing terms. I mean, United boys kind of forced themselves to do it in the park as well. Willie once said to me, I said to him, I was talking about, did you ever get a chance to go to Rangers and all the rest? And he did, a couple of times there was Rangers sniffed about him. But Willie was saying that, there was a spell when the Dons were really dominant. And the game was kind of United, Aberdeen, Celtic, and Rangers, for a spell in Scottish football were nowhere. And he said that there was one occasion, they were waiting in the tunnel to go down the tunnel at Ibrox, and he looked round. He says, the Rangers players were literally shaking. Because they knew what was happening. They knew that in 5-10 minutes that crowd would be on their back because they knew they weren't good enough. They knew Aberdeen were a much superior side. Much of that was down to Fergie, who was Jim was arguably a master tactician, but Fergie was a master psychologist. And he had. That's not to say Jim didn't get. Jim could get the boys playing for him, but I mean, I think often the guys played for themselves against them. Whereas they did play for Ferguson, and Ferguson could be a ruffled character as well in the dressing room. I mean, he could be mental, as was wee Jim. But I think there were differences in character, and I mean, there were really, really good United sides who went and lost games they shouldn't have against Motherwell, against St Mirren, against Celtic, against Rangers, and they lost games they shouldn't have, in my view, but they did. And I think that was, I think there was a fundamental flaw with him in the respect that I don't think he believed in himself enough. And he was a great coach. He was a tremendous coach. One of the very, very top. I mean, right up there with the top Scottish coaches. Steen, Ferguson, and wee Jim. And the ones who south of the border. But I think that was a flaw. That was the kind of fly in the ointment, I think, with him. That the United lost so many of those games.
Yeah, too much stick, maybe not enough carrot. For you personally, Jim, what was it like going from a fan who I would imagine worshipped Jim McLean to someone who then went on to work in the press, and you would have had to deal with them in a professional setting? What was your experience like, and did it alter your perception in any way?
Well, and it was quite intriguing because I came to journalism a bit later, and I was, I'd gone back and did a law degree in my late 20s, was teaching law at Dundee College, and very quickly into it was almost running 2 jobs. I was working for Sports Sound at the BBC on a Saturday. I was nipping up to Tannadice on Friday afternoons to do the interviews and all the rest of it. And I mean, to some extent, I kind of caught my main dealings with Jim often as a manager were often for hospital radio. What
Mm-hmm.
before I'd gone to BBC, a great many, the bulk of my dealings probably the BBC came when he was chairman. And but by then they were going through managers, at a rate of knots. But I wouldn't say I worshipped him. I mean, to be honest with you, when I used to write for the fanzine, there was a period where probably like a lot of the guys, I realised he was past his sell-by date as a manager, and
Right.
he was. I mean, it happens to everyone.
Yeah.
It happens to every manager under the sun. They either go of their own accord or they get the sack. But he was actually, to deal with as chairman, he was fine.
Yeah.
He was. I had my run-ins with him. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I broke a story one day, on Sports Sound on the radio, our traditional hookup before we went on air and went live. Richard Gordon, the ringmaster, would go around the grounds. You go, wee chick young, what have you got? Whoever else, Charlie Man at Tynecastle, or what have you got? The various supporters. And he came to me and he said, "What have you got, Jim?" I went, "Well," I said, "there's a couple of Irish guys trying to buy into Dundee United." He said, What's that?" I said, "Well, a couple of Irish guys trying to buy in. I think I'm trying to remember the name of it. One of them, this had come from a pal of mine. He was a businessman in fact, the guy who almost bought Dundee United some years ago. And he'd given me the names of these two Irish guys who were involved. I think they were involved in Shelburne at the time. And he wanted to take
Right.
a 10% stake in United. I think they saw the way things were going. They could bring some kind of skills. One of them was actually trained as a surgeon
Mm-hmm.
in Dundee at Ninehouse Hospital. And the other was a businessman. I think he'd been commercial manager in Irish football at one stage. So I tossed and turned with this the night before. I thought, to go to wee Jim and ask him to come on the programme, or he'll tell me to, tell me to F off, basically. So I didn't. So I went on, and I knew he sat down in the coaches room
Listen.
and listened on the transistor. So I knew he did this, And anyhow, Richard comes to me, "Oh, big breaking story." We always pick it up, Big breaking story, Tannadice, Jim Spence was as well, Irish. I'm just trying to kind of play it up along the lines of the old Dundee Hibernian, and Jim will be delighted some money coming to the club and all the rest of it. And and Richard said to me, "And what's the Dundee United chairman saying about this, Jim?" I said, "I'll tell you in 2 seconds, Richard," because I could see wee Jim storming along towards the gantry and the Jerry Kerr stand. He's shouting and bawling up at me, So he come up, and what I should have done was I should have put the headphones on him, but I didn't. I taken the headphones off to discuss with him,
Yeah.
And he called me, well, he called me all sorts of things, He certainly called me a liar. And I had the letter. I had the letters from the two guys, and more importantly,
Yeah.
I had the letter from United back to them. So I pulled it out of my pocket, and he looked at me and he says to me, "I had a problem with you." He says, "Is you? What's the old phrase? Is it you run with the you hunt with the hounds and you run with the hare?" You think you meant a two-faced git. But I had it bank right, so to speak. And the way he went, I thought, that's it. I'll be banned. Next week, he was as good as new with me. He was great.
Yeah.
I went up to interview him, and he was great. He was. You could never. I could never read him. I could never
Yeah.
read him. I did a kickboxing night for when Raymond McKinnon was playing at the club, and so Jim and I were kind of there as guests of honour at one of the hotels in Dundee. And he turned and he went at me, "Hey you!" And I thought, "Well, here we go." I said, "What is it?" And he went, "I just want to say one thing to you." I thought, "Wait, I get a tongue lashing here." I went, "What?" And he went, "I've always respected you as a journalist." I think
Wow.
Graham Spears said an interesting thing to me, that he seemed to kind of have a wee admiration for guys who had done something outside of football, hadn't just always been journalists, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Spearsy had done a degree, at St Andrews University. I'd gone back and did a law degree. He knew I was a law lecturer and all the rest of it. And that seemed to he seemed to have a wee soft spot. But
Yeah.
that's not. That's not to say you got an easy ride. It was. It wasn't the first time he phoned the house and demanded to speak to me. Well, I switched the mobile off and I was in the pub with my mates, and my wife had to deal with him.
Yeah.
He could be a volatile character.
Oh, absolutely. So, 1988, Jim McLean. I had to read this twice when I read it. He gets a
Mm,
3-year ban, a 3-year
yeah.
touchline ban for a reaction to a Paul Hegarty red card. I don't know if he served the touchline ban, but he retires in 1993.
Mhm.
Quite
Yeah.
incredibly, Dundee United
Mhm.
actually win the Scottish Cup the year after he goes.
Mhm.
Was there a kind of clamour for him to go at the end, or was he kind of? What was the end like? I've seen images of great managers, like I've seen Forrest, Brian Clough was there for a similar time.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of, even though they got relegated, he was.
Yeah.
They had to basically drag him, off the
Mm-hmm.
pitch.
Yeah.
What was it like at the end for McLean?
Um, he faced. I mean, he faced eventually some real pressure at Tannadice from from fans. But particularly as chairman, I have to say. I mean, there was the United for Change movement, which kind of was very much the brainchild of Mike Watson, Lord Watson.
Yes.
Who still sits in the House of Lords, and a couple of lads who were pals of mine, Martin Manzi and Steve Malone, and Derek Robertson, who latterly went on the board at Tannadice with the late Eddie Thompson. So, Jim did. I mean, the very early days. I mean, in the very early days, his first season in, there were chants and the shed end for McLean to go. I mean,
Right.
because people didn't immediately take to him or his tactics. But he undoubtedly he had he did there was a bit of a love-hate relationship. I think eventually, broke through. And then, as you say, he could never run the Scottish Cup. And then, he brings in Ivan Golak, who'd been this tremendous defender, at Southampton, and Ivan wins the cup at the first time of asking. Now,
You couldn't write
bizarrely, I was on the bus. I was on the
right.
team bus that day from the hotel in East Kilbride. We'd approached Rangers on Dundee United and said, look, could we put a reporter on the bus to do live interviews? So in the days when BBC Scotland actually had some money, I think we had a helicopter above for radio signals, but I was on doing interviews on the bus. And Ivan was great, he was just he was life and soul of the party, and the guys were all so relaxed and all the rest of it. And Billy McKinlay, Badger, who's now Davy Moyes' assistant at Everton, Badger was up at the back of the bus. Now, he wasn't playing, I think he was injured or suspended, I'm trying to remember which. But he was, a great character, and he was keeping the kind of fun and the laughter going and all the rest. And I remember at one stage thinking, I should get off and stop at a bookies here. This mob are going to win the cup, And
Yeah.
sure enough, they did. Now, I mean, I was live on the bus into Hampden. I was the trackside radio reporter that day. Hazel was the telly reporter. And Hazel had been at St Andrews Uni. Hazel had a wee soft spot, I think, for United as well, so it was a remarkable occasion. You're on there, you're trying to be very professional. Guys like Jim McInerney are giving you a big hug and all the rest. It's an astonishing day. And what happened after it was even more astonishing. I mean, I remember interviewing Golang after the game, and I said to him, before the game, he'd been kind of winding Rangers up all week, and it worked magnificently. And I said to him, Ivan, look, you're a great kind of music man. You love the Rolling Stones, When you have the music on tonight, will be a party in the Golang house? He said, Jim, he says, yeah, the music will be on. He says, and I just say this, Walter, for you, it's all over now, And it was stuff like that. It was brilliant, I mean, I say that. I mean, I mean no harm to the late great Walter, who was fantastic. I always got on very well with him. But afterwards, I thought I'm going to get out and try and get Jim McLean. So I got outside of Hampden, and I remember Richard Gordon presenting, saying, "Jim Spence is seeing the Dundee United manager, and he's going to try and get an interview with him." And what happened next? I might have got the sack for him, but Jim was sitting at the front of the bus. You got the steps in the bus, and there's a seat that kind of overlooks the steps.
Yes.
Jim was sitting there, and he was glowering. He was glowering. The team were kind of starting to make their way out. And I got on and I put the microphone in front of him, and I went, Jim, I'm with the Dundee United manager now, Dundee United chairman now. Jim, can I? And I'm not telling you what he said to me. I don't want to swear on your podcast, but he told me to, and I thought, oh, no. And I realised I'd heard it, but then I realised I hadn't actually heard it through my headphones.
Yeah.
I'd heard it, but not through the headphones. The battery had gone dead just as I'd stuck the mic in front of his face. Otherwise, BBC Scotland listeners would have heard this foul-mouthed tirade aimed at me. So that was it. So I mean, and the next day, the Lord Provost had asked me to present the trophy and to the winning team and present the proceedings from the city square. So I'm up there at the City Chambers in Dundee on the balcony, and there's 20,000 Arabs in the square below, and they're up Reform Street and all the rest of it. And I brought them out, and I introduced the two of them. So they've got a handle of the cup each.
Yeah.
And Jim's kind of looking at him like that, it was bizarre. It was just bizarre, and of course, I mean, but by the end of quickly into the next season, I mean, United started the season off, I think, against Hibs and got tucked 5-1 or something, as I recall.
Yeah.
And Ivan was away quite quickly after that. I remember going in one day and he was sitting with one of the players and I chapped the door and I looked in and he went, I said, oh, so he says, no, Jim, come in, come in. So I think he knew the writing was on the wall. And I said, well,
Yeah.
what's going to happen? He says, well, he says, soon for me, it'll be Escape from Stalag 15. It was, so you sensed then that things were kind of going pear-shaped. They'd had this
Yeah.
magnificent victory
Yeah.
against Rangers, and of course, excuse me, two homegrown laddies, conspiring for the goal, Chris Daly and Craig Brewster, both whom are good acquaintances of mine, and so it was a wonderful day.
Yeah.
If you were an Arab or the Tangerine persuasion, but we Jim kind of, I mean, whether it rankled him, and I have a
Mm.
feeling it did, that he
Yeah.
brought Ivan in, and Ivan was so different from him. I mean, you literally would take the guys for a walk in Camperdown Park, they'd go for a coffee and all the rest of it instead of
Yeah.
training. He was such an off-the-wall character. I think
Yeah.
we Jim would think, I think Jim thought he had a part-timer on his hands, and
Yeah.
it was against everything in his boot.
Yeah.
But it was Jim at Brom. It was Jim
Yeah.
at Brom, so there's no rhyme or reason to it.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. We're almost there, Jim. But you know where we're going next. He stays on as chairman to October 2000, and he leaves after punching John Barnes during an
Mm.
interview. I remember how this was received in the outside world. I was at school at the time. I remember my
Yeah.
dad talking about it. I remember everyone talking about it, right? How was it received from like the inside world of football, your colleagues in the media and
Mhm.
inside the game? How did that all unfold?
Well, I mean, it cost Jim dearly because he had to stand down, but it also, it was seen in two different ways. A lot of punters thought it was very, very, I mean, to this day they'll make cracks about it and have a laugh about it and all the rest of it.
Hmm.
I can laugh at most things, but I'm very circumspect when it comes to, because John was a very good colleague of mine. We
Yeah,
called him Digger Barnes, and John was a lovely guy, and is a
yeah,
lovely guy. He was also a fairly tough character. He played in the Ayrshire Juniors. I think he played for one of the Irvine sides. Um, I, 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 Jim, I think Jim did regret it, and he regretted in particular it happened with John. He was under massive pressure and all the rest of it. No doubt about that. Tommy, his brother, was manager at the time. It was all going pear shaped, but that's neither here nor there. None of that forgives. None of that could forgive. What he did to John. It was absolutely bizarre because I would have normally been at Tannadice that day, but my producer had sent me to Pittodrie, excuse me, where Claudio Caniggia was to be making his debut for Dundee.
okay,
So I'd gone away up to cover the game for television, which it's almost like a day off. It's a half-time report, a quick 30 seconds at the end, and that's you. And that was long before the days when you write online pieces and all the rest of it. So I'd grown up and I had watched the game, and I take my young lad who I think well now run that past me again because my oldest is 33. So that what date was that? That was 90. No, sorry, it was. I think Laurie was 10 at the time. My oldest was 10 at the time, give or take. He was. It was actually play. He was a goalie at Dundee Football Club. He'd signed primary 7 for Dundee.
oh,
So anyhow, I'd taken Laurie to Pittodrie. Finished up, said my goodbyes to folk, jumped in the car in the Pittodrie car park right outside the main stand. And before I jumped in the car, I was having a blather with Peter Marr, who
hmm,
was one of the Dundee owners, along with his brother Jimmy, and his son-in-law, Rab Douglas, who was playing his last game for Dundee that day. Rab was going away to Celtic. So we're chewing
yeah,
the fat, having a blather, said my cheerios to him, jumped in the car, literally drove through the gates at the car park. My phone went, and it was the cameraman Bob Ray, who'd been working that
hmm,
day. Bob's a Dundee guy. And I can remember his words. His words are imprinted in my brain. And he said to me, Jim, he says, you'll never guess what's just happened. And I went, what's happened, Bob? What's happened? Expecting something, well, it was bad news, but, he said, oh, God, he says, the chairman is just chin digger. And that was his exact, he says, he's just chin digger. He says, he's punched
yeah,
John in the face. I went, dear God. I says, have you got that on camera? And he says it was on the tripod. He says we didn't get it. He says, but it's all. He says the audio is
yeah,
all there. So I mean that night I raced back to well, I raced back to tell Peter and Rob what had happened, and it was round the houses in about 2 minutes flat. I raced back up to Dundee, and then I was on standby. I mean, I was kind of immediately kind of called in. I was away at Tannadice, kind of waiting on what happened. And of course, he had to stand down, and I think Doug Smith, who had been the club's legendary skipper, under Jerry Kerr and for a long time under Jim too. Doug stepped into the breach as chairman, so it basically brought Jim's chairmanship, to an end, and then. One thing and another. Eventually, it led to him selling the club to Eddie Thompson. In time to come. But I mean, it was a grim ending.
Yeah.
To his managerial period, his chairmanship, and I think people saw it differently. A lot of fans to this day thought it was amusing, and that's football for you and all the rest of it. I didn't. And I don't think any of my journalistic colleagues did, because most of them, we've all been in a position where we've had words with managers and all the rest of it, but nobody expects that. We know there's been stories of managers who've offered players square goals and all that. I mean, somebody once did say to me, "What would you have done?" I said, well, "You could never say in these circumstances." I said, "But I'm a Dundee scheme boy." I said, "So I don't think you'd have chinned me." No, I mean, it was unforgivable. It really wasn't. And it was done to one of the nicest guys in the game, John Barnes. John's a great lad, and I know Jim apologised to him later on, but it should never have happened.
No. Finally, Jim, just to finish up, Jim McLean, he sort of disappeared from public view after that, apart from he had a brilliant column, the Daily Record, which was kind of the column Who Packs a Punch, I actually remember it was called. And he sadly passed away in December 2020, I think I'm right in saying.
Yeah.
What's his legacy for Dundee United, for Scottish football, and where does he rank in the pantheon of great Scottish managers?
Well, in the pantheon of great, I think in terms of Scottish domestic stuff, he's right up there with kind of Stein and Ferguson, and those are the two biggies. I mean, they won European trophies. Jim didn't, but I mean, he took United to kind of a semi-final. He took them to a final. In European terms, some quarter-finals too. But he took basically a very, very small club, to great things, 2 League Cups, the league win, the European stuff we've talked about. He produced a whole coterie for many, many years. He produced a whole coterie of gifted young players who went on to great things, from Andy Gray in the early days to Christian Daly, to Billy McKinlay, to Raymond Stewart, all of these guys, the ones who didn't move, like Paul, David Neary, Paul Hegarty, Paul Sturrock, he produced a whole litany of wonderful players. And I think he also he gave a great deal of pride, I think, to the Scottish game. I mean, Dundee United were very, very widely admired, I think, right throughout Scotland. Not just by United fans. I mean, to this day, I have a chat on, I still call it Twitter, but on X, with a lot of Celtic men who, wish desperately they'd signed Hegarty and Neary during their great days, and they might have won the big cup again, as they put it. They were very well respected in Edinburgh. There was a mutual admiration between United and Aberdeen fans as well. Given what United had done, but he took a very small club, in Scottish terms, and he propelled them, I think, to become very much the club they are today. Where I know they've had ups and downs since that, but from his stepping into the manager's chair all those years ago, I don't think anyone would have thought United would have achieved A, what they've achieved, and B, become the kind of club who, when they get relegated, people go, "I can't believe that, Dundee United relegated," So I think he took them to a different level. He produced some wonderful Scottish players, wonderfully talented Scottish players. He advanced coaching, I think, tremendously as well. People like Jock Stein, people like Alex Ferguson, Craig Brown, were all great fans of his and his abilities. But mainly, I think, in terms of kind of, pure coaching ability, he's right up there, I think, with Big Jock and Sir Alex as well. He's I do not think you will see his likes again in the Scottish game.
No. Well, Mr. Jim Spence, I've loved that. It's been a great trip down memory lane. It's been a privilege and an education, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Callum. Pleasure.
No problem.